Pablo, before you start, I'll just give a little intro to you. Pablo was born in Buenos Aires and lives and works in London and Kent. He uses drawing, sculpture, installation and performance to explore the role of urban architecture in influencing our behaviour, movements and social customs. Bronstein's published numerous books, including A's Building, B's Architecture, Ornamental Design for the Framing of Doors, Gilded Keyholes and a Guide to Postmodern Architecture in London, from which the drawings in our display are taken. He has exhibited internationally, most recently at Red Cap Los Angeles and Centre d'Art Contemporain Geneva, and his work is held in collections of Tate and MoMA New York, amongst others. Pablo, do you want
Hi. Okay. I made a series of drawings for a book in 2000, and I started the drawings in 2006. I published a book in, I think, 2007. It was called Guide to Postmodern Architecture in London, and essentially I think I did it from a sort of biographical point of view. I was interested in these sort of decayed Thatcherist monuments, but especially because at that time we were in a kind of context of hysterical cultural boom in London. The Frieze Art Fair had started and was in full swing, and we almost felt, or it was presented as if things were, had no history, but were going to last forever. We had finally sort of discovered the way to make things look good and be important. And we were ignoring a lot of these monuments that had come from a period that were similarly optimistic and delusional. And so I started to, I remember when there was such antagonism in the art world to those particular periods in our recent art history that when I would mention certain figures from that past, from the early 80s, late 70s, they would be edited out of interviews. And so I thought that I should really sort of treat a lot of this stuff as distant past and almost give it a sense of, acceptability through its ruination. This is number 1 Poultry, the TVAM building. I did a series of the 80s gone mad in London. This is Blackfriars Tunnel. This is a sort of Terry Farrell-esque redesign of Embankment. And this is in relation to what Adam was talking about, the erection of the Paternoster Square column. Now, in the middle of Paternoster Square, there is an elaborate classical column with a sort of flame ball, sculpted flame ball above, and a sort of fountain underneath, or some benches underneath that mimic a sort of fountain and so on. And what this thing is essentially a ventilation shaft that connects to the car park downstairs. And one of the things that I think I was interested in at the time, this is around 2007, I think again, was that the language of classical architecture was being deployed very, very cynically and extremely successfully to regenerate parts of London that had previously felt public, but hadn't looked public. Perhaps they even were public and were now in a process of being sold off in a few cases. I don't think that's the case of Paternoster Square. And entering a state of private ownership, but with the necessary aesthetic of publicness, in order to convince us that this was politically acceptable. Paternoster Square is the perfect example of that. And so I became interested. It's true, it's absolutely not public space, and you're made to really feel that when you start to do something that you can do in normal places, like take a photo. But in order for us to warm to places like Paternoster Square, classicism is extremely significant, because classicism is, of course, associated with law courts, justice, democracy, for example. It's also associated with refinement, superiority in all sorts of ways. And so what I did was dramatize a moment of architecture that is entirely false. In other words, the Paternoster Square column was probably sort of sprayed on with various bits of crap out of a sachet, you know, and erected over a steel frame overnight. And I sort of transformed it into a moment of architectural drama à l'ancienne. The same with the transportation of Temple Bar, which is this entranceway to Paternoster Square next to St Paul's Cathedral, which is actually by Wren, designed by Wren, but of course it wasn't designed for that location. It was designed for halfway down the street, and it was in storage for 50 years, I think, as part of, it was in some basement, essentially, and then it was erected over a steel frame again. And so I transformed it into a kind of ancient regime style grand event within the creation of very, very public cityscape. This question of how people move around buildings and relate to architecture, I think, is ongoing. I'm very interested, I think, in how we are affected by the particular aesthetic of buildings, as well as how they may contain us or may push us down the corridor. And so there was this extremely kitsch arch that this ballerina eulogized, overpraised, so she would sort of address it, you know, as if it were a sort of object of love and veneration. I think this particular work was also in reaction to a lot of the work that was happening at the time that was entirely de-objected performance. It was people jumping up and down in a room. There was a lot of work by Tina Segal at the time that was extremely well, it was extremely conceptual in the way that it was organised. It was a sort of sheet of paper with a series of instructions, and they would be communicated. It was a verbal communication to the dance, and the dance would then simply enacted in a gallery space. And so I plonked this enormous, elaborate lump of messy chipboard in order to, you know, give her something to point to. This is about Soane and Nash and the mass production of a certain sort of classicism and the tailoring of another sort of classicism. You've got an attic by Soane, which is supposedly something that is ramshackle and added on at the end, but in fact it's the sort of architectural highlight of a very bland Nash terrace. This is a ballet performance of Paternoster Square. It's quite an early piece. I think it's in the wrong place. This is the cover of the Postmodern Architecture in London book, and that's it.